Beijing. The number of people killed in the military operation at Tiananmen Square is not clear, but reports suggest it could be between 300 to 500. The crackle of machine gun fire could be heard sporadically today from the city centre near Tiananmen, the focal point of the pro-democracy protest. Eyewitnesses say troops in front of the Museum of the History of the Chinese Revolution opened up on crowds on Chang'an Avenue, the crowds dispersing, then regrouping. The exact number of deaths from the army's assault on Tiananmen is difficult to determine, but eyewitnesses say as many as 300 people have been killed or wounded. Violent clashes occurred overnight with vehicles being set on fire. The centre of Beijing became a bloody battlefield as troops backed by armoured vehicles and tanks smashed their way into Tiananmen Square, firing indiscriminately into the crowds. There are reports that several soldiers were lynched by demonstrators and left for dead on the pavement. In the square, the tents of students and their belongings went up in flames. The assault on the square began from three sides, sending tens of thousands of people fleeing in panic. The troops had approached behind construction vehicles, which cleared away barricades of buses. As students and residents left the square, they could not control their tears. The students shouted, "We shall return."
China's state-run television has aired footage of troop activity following the aftermath of the bloodbath, but has made no mention of the casualties. Julie Mapleston reports.
In a sombre voice, a newsreader said that at 4:30 a.m. troops agreed to allow students to withdraw from Tiananmen Square. It said troops began to move in at about 5 o'clock and the task was completed in 30 minutes. There was very little commentary on the event and no mention was made of the massacre. A report also aired at noon without any visuals said the anti-revolutionary turmoil had deteriorated sharply in Beijing. Blame was placed on a group of robbers bent on throwing the whole country into turmoil. The official media said that the army had suppressed a counter-revolutionary riot and that it was a great victory in the struggle to end turmoil in the capital. There was only one exception to the blackout on news of civilian casualties. A maverick announcer for Radio Beijing English language service reported that troops fired indiscriminately, killing thousands of people, mostly innocent civilians. The unidentified announcer asked listeners to protest against the most barbarous suppression of the people. He was later replaced by another announcer who repeated the government line.
Meanwhile, protests have been staged in major Chinese cities to condemn the government's bloody massacre. Despite pouring rain, students in Shanghai put up barricades and bus drivers went on strike. More than 100,000 people are said to have taken to the streets in Nanjing, and there have been protests in Guangzhou, Xi'an and other key cities. Posters with the Chinese character for blood have appeared around the country.
Local trade unionists have called for a general strike on Wednesday to protest against the killings in Beijing. As Carolyn Libby reports, the call came at a mass funeral at Happy Valley Racecourse.
Organizers of the rally in Happy Valley have called for a territory-wide strike this Wednesday to protest against the Chinese government's violent repression of demonstrators in Beijing. They are urging everyone in Hong Kong to join in, except for medical and transport workers and the financial community. They aren't calling for these sectors to join in because they don't want the strike to hurt the territory. People at the rally today are extremely angry and upset. 3 of the speakers broke into tears during their speeches. Legislative councillors Martin Lee and Sito Hua have announced that they refuse to work on the Basic Law Drafting Committee until there's a government in China which represents the will of the people. They're calling on other Basic Law drafters to do the same. Mr. Sito says there's no way such a corrupt government could come up with a good draft of the Basic Law. Organizers of the rally are also calling for a boycott of Chinese goods and Chinese banks. Protesters here are calling for Chinese leaders Li Peng and Deng Xiaoping to be tried and punished for the violence in Beijing. The stage today was draped in black, and organizers say this was a memorial service for people that were killed in Beijing. Following speeches by leaders of the alliance, members of the public came up and expressed their views about the situation in China. Their speeches were cheered very enthusiastically. There were also videotapes throughout the day showing people in Beijing fighting against the troops. Organizers say over 200,000 people came to the rally today. Protesters are currently packing the streets and have marched by the NCNA and are on their way to Central, where they'll disperse later this evening.
Motorists also demonstrated their anger at events in China with a noisy protest through the streets of Dimsa-Choi and Central. Julie Mapleston reports.
Traffic was brought to a standstill in Central this morning as taxi drivers staged a go-slow through the heart of the business district, honking their horns in condemnation of the assault on protesters in Beijing. Media rivals also banded together today with a similar protest from Kings Park to the Star Ferry and back again.
The Governor, Sir David Wilson, has expressed shock and sadness at the loss of life in Beijing in an interview with Radio Hong Kong.
All of us in Hong Kong have been watching with great concern what has been happening in Peking and in China over these past few weeks. We've been watching with intense interest the way in which the problem would be handled and what the outcome would be. I think most of us here have been watching, listening very carefully to every news broadcast that has been coming out of Peking, and we have been served extremely well by those who have been carrying the news to us with such speed. But it is tragic news. I have listened this morning with shock and with deep sadness to the news in Peking of the tragic events there, and I'm particularly saddened and shocked by the loss of life in Peking. I'm sure that these are sentiments that will be shared by most people in Hong Kong. It is a time for sad and sober reflection.
Visitors returning from Beijing have spoken of the gloomy atmosphere that has engulfed the city following last night's bloodbath. Julie Mapleston reports.
Tourists and business people who flew into Hong Kong from the Chinese capital said the streets were filled with troops. Getting transport around the city has been difficult, but they say the airport is still operating as normal.
Early this morning, there was some violence last night. Some troops attempted to enter Tiananmen Square. The Beijing police, it wasn't the military. And the students threw rocks and cut branches off of trees and sharpened them as sticks to keep the troops away. Everybody is very depressed, very sad. Anyone out on the street is trying to listen to radio to find out what's happening. Last night the mood was, I think, very exuberant and happy. And then this morning it was very cold, people were very disappointed and gloomy.
They had troops lined up on the main road to the airport. We were out last night and I took some pictures until they told me not to.
A government spokesman has advised Hong Kong residents currently staying in Beijing to stay indoors until the violence subsides. Residents have also been advised against travelling to the Chinese capital. The spokesman says anyone in need of assistance should contact the British Embassy in Beijing.
The Australian Prime Minister, Mr. Hawke, has condemned the killings in Beijing and cancelled an Australian Navy visit to Shanghai. Britain and Japan have expressed concern about the events in China, and American President Mr. Bush deplored the use of violence against protesters.
Has strengthened the tone of its diplomatic messages to Beijing. President Bush, vacationing in Kennebunkport, Maine, said, "I deeply deplore the decision to use force against peaceful demonstrators and the consequent loss of life." And he urged Beijing to return to nonviolent methods to deal with pro-democracy demonstrators. On CNN's Newsmaker Saturday, Secretary of State James Baker described the turn of events as ugly and chaotic. But already some in Congress are calling for a sterner reaction. Congressman Stephen Solars called the administration response weak, and he said the U.S. should recall its ambassador for consultations, cut off technology transfers, and suspend arms sales.
I simply do not see how we can politically or morally justify the continued sale of American arms to a country whose military establishment uses rifles, machine guns, and bayonets to kill their own people and to suppress their democratic aspirations.
North Carolina Senator Jesse Helms also called for an immediate end to military cooperation with China. But others say there isn't a lot the Bush administration can do to affect events in China.
Chinese nationals living in the United States have reacted with fear and anger as they listened to reports on the assault on pro-democracy students in Beijing. They staged rallies in key American cities to express their indignation over the incident.
Told very considerably that at one hospital alone there are 100 injured and 26 dead.
American television would tell them of the horror back home.
I was shocked, but I'm not surprised.
Chinese students studying at Georgia Tech in Atlanta listened and watched, knowing family and friends could be among the dead and injured, victims of the government crackdown.
There were 28 people who were shot, not by a handgun, but by a machine gun.
An ad hoc group calling itself the Tri-State Organization for Democracy in China gathered in Manhattan's Battery Park. The expressions of support were made in the shadow of the Statue of Liberty, a symbol the students in Beijing have themselves adopted. New York Mayor Ed Koch branded the initial U.S. response to the growing crisis namby-pamby, and he urged the Bush administration to demand an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council.
So if the whole world says, shame, 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 they may change.
Some 40,000 Chinese nationals are studying in the United States. In Los Angeles, students had intended to distribute thousands of blue ribbons in Chinatown, but news of the bloodshed changed their plans. Instead, they brought their anger to the steps of the Chinese consulate. Protesters also gathered at the Chinese embassy in Washington. The Chinese students and Chinese Americans promised to continue their protests. They are desperate, they say, to end the killing.
And now for the rest of the day's news. Iran's spiritual leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, has died at the age of 86. The Ayatollah's death came 11 days after he underwent intestinal surgery.
Khomeini first appeared on the international stage in 1978 when he arrived in France. It was the last stop of a long exile that began in the early 1960s, when Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi expelled Khomeini for criticizing his rule. From his home outside Paris, the Ayatollah launched his Islamic revolution. With access to the world press, he called on Iranians to rise up against what he called the Shah's oppressive and corrupt regime. By January 1979, the Shah had fallen. 2 weeks later, Khomeini made a triumphant return to his homeland and set himself up as head of the world's first Islamic republic. He executed many of the Shah's ex-ministers and imposed strict Islamic policies. Women were forced to don the floor-length veil that had been abandoned in the 1920s. Alcohol was outlawed under penalty of public flogging, and opponents were imprisoned or executed. In the international arena, Khomeini began a vehement campaign against the West, particularly the United States, which he called the Great Satan, blaming it for, quote, infecting Iran with corrupt Western values. In November 1979, militant Islamic extremists stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and held 52 hostages for 444 days. Khomeini had delivered the U.S. one of its worst humiliations in recent history and played a major role in costing President Jimmy Carter his bid for re-election in 1980. The hostages were released moments after Ronald Reagan was sworn in, January 1981. Still, Iran continued its terrorist campaign against the U.S. Beirut, October 1983, more than 200 U.S. servicemen were killed when a car bomb exploded at the Marine headquarters. Another car bomb at the U.S. Embassy in Beirut took 17 American lives. There were more bombs and more deaths in European capitals as well. Intelligence sources blame fundamentalist Islamic Shiites directed by Iran for these attacks and for kidnapping Americans in Lebanon. Although some have been released, 9 Americans and a handful of other Western citizens still are being held hostage in the Middle East. Khomeini also took on his Arab neighbors, promising to spread radical Islamic fundamentalism throughout the Muslim world. Strapped financially, faced with high unemployment, inflation, and massive shortages, analysts agree decisions have to be made in Tehran, whether passing the torch lights Iran's way back into the international community or keeps it in the shadows of isolation.
調子良さ同じ